But I want to say a prayer for my wife because she's going to have to do some more negotiations for this boat for ministry. And even though she met these people through the church, she doesn't know she could trust them, because they're not actually in the church, but the church people know them. Okay. So, anyway, let me pray and then we'll begin. Father God, as we come to you right now, Lord, I just want to pray for a prayer of protection for my wife, Lord. Lord, we never know what people's intents are, Lord, but if this is your money, your ministry, and all of this, Lord, we're confident that you'll watch over things. It doesn't mean that everything is untouchable, but Lord, if it's your will, and the Bible says if we ask anything according to your will, uh, you hear us. And so, Lord, I don't assume your situation, but Lord, I just pray that as my wife goes in faith to negotiate about this boat, Lord, that you be with her, that you help her to be able to speak have clarity when she's speaking, and all of that, Lord. And just if the people have evil intents, Lord, I pray that you um, somehow restrain them, Lord. And with that said, we begin. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so it's been a while since I've streamed because my computer's broke, right? So I'm on my phone and I'm trying to work with that right now. Why do whenever I sit down do I get thirsty? So yeah, I'm thirsty. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my stream so I can see the comments on my chat. I just noticed that my thumbnail it doesn't look very inviting. It's just the Layman Seminary emblem. But maybe some people will show up and ask questions. Yeah, I think that's what I'll do. I'll change the stream's name to Ask Layman. No, somebody else come up here. Um, let's see. What do I say here? Yeah, we'll go with it. Ask Layman. Ask Layman. We'll just call it that. All right. Let's just save it right now. Hello, two people that are out there. I sound like Janet, except Janet would say 2 billion people. She always gets a kick out of doing that. Alright, so now let me bring this up so I can see. Let's see here. Okay, I can see the chat. Now, because I'm streaming wide, I'm probably not going to show up in the shorts feed. I don't have a stand that will hold my phone vertical, and I guess that's what I need to do to show up in the shorts feed. Let me just check. Yeah, it looks like I'm only streaming horizontally, not vertically. But it is what it is. So, um, at least I can see y'all's comments in the chat. So go ahead, ask your questions. And I'm gonna go get some water. But 3 people are already out there I can see. So I'll be right back. Yeah. So I guess what I need to do is I need to pray for the stream as well. Keep in mind, guys, that I don't. My other computer, uh, because it's broke, my microphones and camera and all that stuff is incompatible. So I'm just going off of my phone. All right. But let me just pray for the stream. Because I don't get to do this type of thing often, and maybe I'm getting maybe I'll be doing it more often. Maybe God's redirected me to engage in different ways. But let me pray. Father God, as we come to you right now, Lord, I just pray. I know there's a lot going on, YouTube and all of that, but I felt like that if I didn't start back streaming, Lord, that I would fall into um, I wouldn't say despair, but just it's procrastination, maybe the term. Because even though I come home and I'm tired from work and all of that, God, um, I do need to, I feel so tired. I can't study my seminary stuff right now. But Lord, I do want to talk about you, and I want to talk about your word, and I want to interact with people. And so, Lord, I just pray that you will draw those people that want to learn, want to study, that know me, that don't know me, that want to get to know me, on a spiritual level. Um, just draw those people. There's always a lot of riffraff out there, God, but I'm just asking you be with me, even as you're with my wife, and she's doing the things that she's doing right now concerning the ministry. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yeah, so somebody ask a question in the chat. Okay, there's a little engage with your audience thing. Start a Q&A. All right, so let's just do something simple. Can you lose your salvation? All right, let's see how that works. My assumption is, what do you write? Q&A. So I guess it means people's answers will show up here. Um, I'll go ahead and set a goal. So I don't have my music in my background right now that I typically have, because I'm not doing this from StreamYard. And but what I can do is I can pull up. I've got my Logos. See, I can't. This computer that I'm using right now, it's a substitute computer, but I'm at least able to run Logos and PowerPoint. Hey, Whiskey49, how you doing? Got any questions for me? Yeah, yeah, you can see my full nerdness in effect here. Yeah. Um, but what was I saying? Oh, yeah. Whenever I can't stream on this computer. It won't sustain a stream. That's why I had to uh, pass my debate to Chris Morrison, who debated in my place. I got another debate in about a month, and I'm praying that after I turn in my seminary paper, that I can I can try working on my computer. There's some people that offered to help me with it, so maybe I'll be smart enough to follow their instructions. If not, I pray that God still help me to get it up and running, and then hopefully I don't have to purchase one. Well, the reality is that I can't purchase one right now. So we'll try to get it working. If for whatever reason it's not working, then I'll just wait for the opportune time, and I'll just be redirected to do streams like this. Whiskey49 says, I was just pulling up the boat update to watch, and then I saw you were live. Cam looks crispy, just curious about your PC, but you're already discussing. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So what I think went wrong with my PC is about a year ago. First off, I think it was 3 years ago, some brothers in Christ bought this PC for me. Okay, a good PC, but it didn't have very much RAM. I keep looking right here because the comments are right here, but I need to look in the camera. It didn't have much RAM, and I just think that, and I don't know anything about computers, but I just think that eventually it got to the point where the RAM stopped working. So yeah, that's the situation. And so what we want to do is we want to try to start with those things. Another person suggested what it could be, and we'll just go from there. But yeah, I'm working on a paper right now. Um, but typically, what's been happening is whenever I come home from work, at least on the weekdays, I'll listen to some other stream, or like today, I fellowshipped a little bit on Discord, but I'm just too wiped out to write a paper, to add to my paper writing. And so typically, what happens is I get home Friday night, and usually I'm still too out of it, and I'm like, well, I'll just watch something or whatever, and then finally I get to sleep, and then I wake up Saturday and I hit the paper writing hard, and Sunday same thing. So that seems to be the approach that I've been taking. Uh, but my health, uh, with my back and other things like that, it's just been making it difficult, taking a lot out of me, and so. Uh, that's another reason to be more active in streaming is because uh, the reality is that right now the Layman Seminary can't sustain itself. You know, when you're talking about StreamYard and vidIQ and all the things that you need to be successful on YouTube, and I'm doing it at a very basic level. It adds up. It's like 140 something. That's an average. So I mean, I haven't. I don't think I've ever been in the black. you know, um, but I've been thankful for the provision that God has given. And one good thing is while I've been in this uh, Old Testament survey class, I've been reminded of the jars that never ran out of oil. One of the passages we're studying, and God's provision. So, yeah. Well, Whiskey, looks like you're going to have to be the one to ask questions because nobody else is asking them, even though there's 4 people watching. Um, I guess what I could do, even though I don't have a beat, is I could do some of my reading. I could read some of Eugene. Well, now I can't. I can't do that because then I can't see your comments. I guess I'll have to cut the screen in half. That's the other thing. I have 2 monitors, but this older computer that I'm using right now is not compatible with them. So, like I said, being down with that one computer, it shut me down and my whole system down. um, but yeah, that's the thing. All right, so I'm gonna open up Logos. I guess I'll do some of my reading until people ask questions. So we'll open up Kingdom of Priests, and we'll start with Esther. That isn't the place where I left off, if I remember right, but um, that's where we were in the last lecture. So I can't even spell priest. Priest. Yeah, here we go. Come on, open up. See, right now my system's bogged down. I gotta wait for it to clear. It's all locked up right now on this computer. Y'all could, if I flip this, let's see, which one flips. This one. So you can see it's bogged down. You know. You know what? I got an idea. I don't know how well it'll work, but I don't know. I don't think that will work either. I got a camera on this one. Um, all right. I'm just trying to think of different ways I could do things. Okay, so what chapter are we in? The Restoration and the New Hope. Yeah, let's start there. Chapter 15. Okay. Your questions in the chat, otherwise, I'll be rap reading. And I don't have a beat, not this time. Let's make the font big enough where I can see it. Restoration and the New Hope. Here we go. The history of the Old Testament Israel came to an end within a century of the completion of the Second Temple. Little was known from the biblical documents about the years from 1515 to approximately 474, so the content of this chapter must be limited almost exclusively to the middle half of the 5th century. Hey Derek, what's up? Yeah, I'm glad you agree that no person can lose their salvation. Thanks for answering the poll also. Do you have any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to be reading. But whenever y'all pull up, I'm going to be interacting. Uh-oh, Logout started indexing. I better stop it before it starts clogging me up. Bogging me down. The major biblical sources for these years are Ezra and Nehemiah, but Esther and Malachi also make important contributions to an understanding of specific problems confronting the remaining exilic community and the Judean state, respectively. The Persian influence. Persia, which is modern day Iran. I'm just saying the location. I'm not saying that it's actually Iran. But anyway, the modern nation, I mean. The Persian influence. Persia remained the dominant world power throughout Judah's final biblical era and will continue as such until the rise of Alexander in 333 BC and his conquest of Persepolis in 330. It is therefore important that the course of Persian history be reviewed as at least briefly, or that the biblical story, which everywhere presupposes the Persian influence, may be more fully appreciated. What do you think about the guy rage quitting? Well, here's the thing: you can't say it was rage quitting. He the way he described it, and for those that don't know, I'm talking about the guy that I was originally supposed to debate, that was standing in for that Chris Morrison stood in for me because of my computer being broke. Um, in the middle of the debate, right when he was fixing to start a cross exam of Chris, he left the stream. And so it's not rage quitting. It was the dude. It was like you find out you have no ammo, you have nothing to respond to. Um, his heart failed, if you will. You know, he came in prideful, arrogant. He's still talking trash on my stream on YouTube right now. On my post on YouTube. So I wouldn't call it rage quitting. It was more like a panic attack, the way that he described it. And he said he'll stay on the sidelines now, but now what he wants to do is he wants to debate in the chat. And I'm like, dude, I've already defended my position in 51 formal debates. I said, you're just getting the answer machine. The answer machine is ChatGPT, Super Layman. My Super Layman. Yeah, so I'm still engaging with them, but you know, there's that. All right. How can you lose someone that belongs to God Almighty? And you bring up Revelation 7:10. Yeah, salvation is of the Lord because He's the Savior. Revelation 7:10. What does Revelation 7:10 say? I can't open up another thing. You know what? I'm gonna go old school. I'm gonna pull up my old Bible. Um, or I might grab my Greek text. It might be easier to find. Let me see. Let me see. There's the USB. I'm looking for a particular one. Dang it. Hold on. Turn the light on. I think I got my Bibles down here. I, I might freak y'all out. I gotta. Y'all probably can't hear me. Tell me this ain't ironic. MacArthur's Study Bible. All right, Revelation 7. I need a little bit more light. My eyesight's actually getting bad. Where if I'm looking at my phone, or if I guess when I'm looking at paper, I can't read. I need to get bifocals eventually. Revelation 7. Man, I wish I could just use Logos, but it's messing up. I got one book open, but the other one ain't gonna open. So 7-8. That won't work. Alright. You said 7-8? This is bad. I'm having to switch back and forth like this. 17. I'll start at 9. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribe and people and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Yeah, so I was talking about that passage, but I was thinking about the Old Testament passage. Anyway, we'll just close that. So, now we're cooking with fire. Hey, Smokey. I'm going kind of low tech now. All right. Xerxes. All right. So Xerxes, whenever you're talking, I think that's the one that was also in 300, supposedly. It is depicted in different ways. This is the same one in Esther, all that. This book, Kingdom of Priests, it was written, let's see when it was written. 2008. So there's been more stuff that has been developed, and even stuff that came up in the lectures about some of this stuff. So y'all don't trip on me too much if you hear something you ain't never heard before that you disagree with. Xerxes. Darius Histesippus, I guess. Histepses, maybe. Darius Histepses, under whose auspices the Jewish temple was rebuilt, died in 486 and was succeeded by his son Xerxes, the Old Testament Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Yeah, that's the one from Esther's story. He had been designated heir by his father for some years, so the change in leadership was without contention. By virtue of the governorship of Babylon, Xerxes was admirably prepared to undertake the formidable responsibilities of the new office. Xerxes' first interest lay in the completion of the royal palace at Susa and the further aggrandizement of the Persepolis, so Persian city. The later project occupying him on and off for the 21 years of his reign, 486 to 465. A more pressing concern, however, was that Egypt, which rebelled at once upon his accession. In less than 2 years, he was able to resolve the problem, and by the suppression of the Egyptian religion, he alienated the priests, without whose support he could not reasonably expect Egyptian subservience. Like his father, Xerxes seemed irresistibly drawn to the west and the conquest of Greece, and so after reorganizing his armies and navies, he moved west in 481. The badly divided Greek states were unable to achieve an effective coalition, and at first were badly mauled by the superior Persian forces. Even the redoubtable Spartans were defeated at Thermopylae, although they fought to the last man. There's your 300 right there, supposedly. At Salmis, however, the tide turned, trapping their thousands of Greek warriors. Xerxes underestimated their almost fanatical courage, and as a result lost more than 200 Persian ships. He found a scapegoat at the Phoenician and Egyptian mercenaries, whom he accused of cowardice. They therefore abandoned him and returned to their own countries. Xerxes then left for Persia after placing his general Mardonius in command of the Persian troops still remained in the Greeks. Because of a series of tactical blunders, Mardonius suffered a setback after another until he lost his life in the Battle of Peletea. Yeah. The final blow ending Xerxes' aspirations to conquer Greece was administered at Mycale, Mycale, probably, in 479. The Greeks had now destroyed two of the Persian armies and forced the third to return to Asia. Although this was a shadowing blow to Persia and enabled the Greeks to see what a united front could accomplish. They therefore formed the Delian League in 478 with Athens as the dominant partner. This league helped lay the groundwork for the creation of a Greek nation. Okay. Meanwhile, Xerxes had become completely discredited and thus turned to a life of lascivious indulgence. He dallied with the most beautiful women of the court, including the wives of some of his chief officials, and thereby sowed the seeds of irreparable dissension. At last, his dissipation was rewarded by assassination at the hands of a palace official or jealous husband. Do you think we're currently under the old covenant? No, I don't. Kurt, who will be streaming on his channel now, and I recommend y'all subscribe. He believes that the Mosaic Law is still in operation now, but that the Christian is dead to the law because the covenant is not with the church. Thanks, Howdy. Thanks for the blessing of the different memberships. So no, I don't believe that the old covenant is operational, the Mosaic covenant. Oh wow, yeah, you got these people memberships. Appreciate it. All right. So now we're at Artaxerxes. I usually just say these words fast, but I'm trying to be a little bit more accurate here. Artaxerxes the first. The reign of government should have been handed over to Darius, the eldest son of Xerxes, but instead Artaxerxes' brother murdered him with the encouragement of Artabanus, captain of the guard, and took his place as king. Artaxerxes tried to restore the credibility of the central government by reorganizing the satraps and reducing some of the taxation that his father had imposed. This had little effect, however, and private lands began to fall to the crown because of unpaid taxes. The result was a widespread unrest and even revolt, particularly in the more remote provinces. By 460, Egypt, refusing to pay further tribute, solicited and received support from the Delian League. In this bold act of defiance, Persia undercut their arrangement by bribing Sparta to go to war with Athens, and more than neutralized the league and jeopardized not only Egypt but also Athens. Yes, Howdy, thank you for the memberships, Heather says. There's no way for me to put y'all's comments up. No, it can't work that way. That's a shame. Alright. Athens managed to survive alone and indeed formed something of an empire itself. This provoked further Persian hostility from 450 into the beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars, 431. Territorial control on both sides of the Aegean seesawed between Athens and Persia, with neither gaining permanent advantage. The orator, statesman Pericles had begun to lead Athens to a position of dominance among all the Greek states by 458, a situation that Rest feared and resented. The civil wars that broke out freed Artaxerxes and further concern from his West Asian provinces, allowing him to attend to matters close to home, including the ongoing arrests in Judah over the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. You hear that, guys? So the point is that Artaxerxes didn't want, I think he didn't want Egypt on his back, and he didn't want the Greeks on his back. So he kind of tried to get the city-states, I think there were city-states at that time, to fight each other and all that. So it says right here, the civil wars that broke out freed Artaxerxes of further concern for his Western Asia provinces, allowing him to attend to matters closer to home, including the ongoing unrest in Judah over the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem. And it's my belief that in 444 BC, that's when the decree to go forth to rebuilding occurs. But this says his death is in 424, was approximately coincident with the, uh, or coincided, maybe that's how you say it, coincided with the end of the Old Testament period, and is therefore an appropriate place to conclude our review of Persian history. So we got a little bit of Persian history, right? Now we're going into Esther. And we're not talking about Esther from, oh, what's that, Jefferson's? The only biblical witness to the reign of Xerxes is the Book of Esther, a document whose historicity is denied by practically all critical scholars. This is not because the book contradicts anything that is known of the period from Persian, Greek, or other ex-biblical sources, for it surely does not, but because these sources do not explicitly corroborate such details as the Feast of Purim or even the existence of Esther and her cousin Mordecai. But an argument from silence should never be used in a serious historiography unless irrefutable evidence to the contrary surfaces. One must, on principle, assume that Esther is a reliable historical document originating in, faithfully recounting the era it professes to record. The book of Esther begins in the third year of Xerxes, circa 483. The king was then at Susa presiding over a lavish banquet in honor of the subordinates from all over the empire, from India to Kush. As the narrator puts it, for 6 months Xerxes had exhibited the splendor of his court, and now was capping it off with the 7-day banquet. So he was capping. After a week of reveling and drunkenness, the king demanded that his queen, Vashti, be brought before the assembly so that he might parade her beauty before them as further evidence of their splendor. When she refused to come, Xerxes deposed her and sought for another to take her place as the principal queen. Yeah, so this is not just a beauty context, guys. This is more of the sexual aspect of things here. Alright. The narrator thus paves the way for the introduction of Esther, a young Jewish living in Susa with her older cousin Mordecai. Their presence there suggests both the wide distribution of the Jewish diaspora a century after the fall of Jerusalem and the fact already emphasized that the majority of the exiled Jews remained in the lands of their captivity even when they had the opportunity to leave. Okay, so the main dates you got to remember is 722. Well, I guess you might want to remember 2000, around 2000 BC for Abraham, 1446 BC for the Exodus, 1000 BC for like Saul, David. 931 BC is when the kingdom split, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. 722 BC is the Assyrian captivity. The Babylonian captivity came in different waves. I think the first one was 605, and the last one was 586. So I memorized those dates years ago. Um, maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but those are the ones I tend to have in my mind when I work with. You know. So let's see if that stuff comes up here. All right. All right. Let's see. Their assimilation in the New World is also clear from the names of the principal protagonists in the story. Mordecai is a Hebrew translation of the Babylonian divine name Marduk. Why a pious Jew bears such a name is not easy to answer. Marduk? Yeah, I think of Marduk, the dog in the cartoon. His cousin's name is similarly pagan in its overtones. Esther is a form of Ishtar, the name of the Babylonian goddess of love and war. She also bore a Hebrew name, Hadassah, by which she probably was known to the Jewish community. Mordecai's prominence in the Persian court attests, moreover, that Jews could rise to the highest levels of government and society. One must not make too much of this in the case of Mordecai, however, since he forbade his cousin to disclose her Jewish identity and so most likely hid his own as well. They may help to explain why both he and Esther chose non-Hebrew personal names in the first place. After the requisite time of preparation, Esther was made queen of Xerxes in the 7th year, 479. By then, he had brought both Egypt and Babylonia under control and had launched his unsuccessful campaign against the Greek states. It will be recalled that Xerxes had returned from the west by 479, leaving Mardonius to suffer defeat at the Battle of Plataea. It seems clear that Esther became queen shortly after Xerxes returned from his Greek adventures. Xerxes' humiliated setback may account for the conspiracy uncovered by Mordecai, a plot by two palace officials to assassinate the king, Esther 2. His disclosure of the treachery was duly noted in the archives and would prove later to be of crucial importance in gaining royal favor. The need for such favor came about when Xerxes promoted Haman to prime minister, and Haman then required all other officials to kneel in his presence. Mordecai refused to do so. When asked about the matter, he stated that such behavior was contrary to his conviction as a Jew, very similar to the Daniel situation. Haman decided to get rid of Mordecai and initiate a pogrom against the Jews in general. Xerxes, by then having given any notion of conquering Greece and was looking for someone he could blame, Haman suggested that the Jews would make an ideal target appeal to the king immensely, so an edict of annihilation was issued. This was to be carried out in the 12th year of Xerxes in 474. So this was the first, well, this is the time, I'm not going to say the first time, but this was a time whenever the Jewish race was going to be wiped out. Meanwhile, the king had been researching the archives and came across a record of Mordecai's part in foiling the assassination plot. He therefore decided to promote Mordecai to high office. He also invited Esther to make any request she might have. Boldly revealing her Jewish identity for the first time, Esther told the king all that Haman had plotted against Mordecai and her people. Xerxes immediately put Haman to death and issued a countermanding decree authorizing the Jews throughout the empire to protect themselves against Haman's evil purge. When the local officials everywhere understood that Xerxes was now in support of the Jews, they joined in the effort to put down the anti-Jewish campaign. And so once more, the God of Israel, though never mentioned by name in the book of Esther, bared his mighty arm on behalf of his people. To commemorate this miraculous deliverance, a Feast of Purim was instituted, a festive occasion to mark the turning of sorrow into joy. Along with the Mosaic festivals, Jews in every generation must celebrate it without fail as a commemoration of God's faithful preservation of Israel. Sequenced returns, Ezra and Nehemiah, the problem or priority. So we're going to get into some structural stuff that's going on in these books. I'm not going to go into too much detail unless this brings it up. I know our lectures brought it up. About 16 years after the institution of Purim and Susa, Ezra the scribe and priest made his way from Babylon to Jerusalem at the head of a contingent of Jewish returnees. He dates his journey to the 7th year at Artaxerxes, that is 458. Not only was his return permitted by the Persian king, Artaxerxes also issued a decree, the text of which Ezra had preserved, and whatever silver and gold Ezra received from the king from Babylonian sources and from Jews elsewhere should be taken back to Jerusalem and used for the purchase of sacrificial animals for the temple of Yahweh. If that was not enough, more could be requested from the royal treasury. If there was a surplus of funds, it could be used in any way Ezra and his people wished. Finally, Ezra was authorized to appoint public officials throughout the Trans-Euphratean satrapy, so satraps. These were to be men who were to be expert and would enforce the Torah. A problem concerns the identity of the Artaxerxes who issued the decree. Dependent on the answer to this problem are the dates of Ezra's return and hence the chronological sequence of Ezra and Nehemiah. Traditional scholarship has maintained that it was under Artaxerxes I, 464 to 424, that Ezra went to Jerusalem and that Nehemiah did so under the same king 13 years later. Ezra's pilgrimage was in Artaxerxes' 7th year, 458, and Nehemiah in his 20th year, 445. So if you want a good study Bible that has a lot of this information in it, the Nelson New King James Study Bible. The author, Eugene Merrill, that's writing this stuff, he's in there, but it gives all the dates and all that stuff. I used it for years. Now I just recommend people use Constable's Notes because it's updated every year. But I remember that his writings are in that study Bible, so that's why I mentioned that. An alternative view that has gained considerable following argues that Nehemiah indeed returned to Jerusalem in 445 under Artaxerxes I, but Ezra did not return until the 7th year, Artaxerxes II, whose reigned from 404 to 358. This would place Ezra's return in 398 and give Nehemiah's chronological priority by more than 45 years. The position of John Bright, on the other hand, is that Ezra arrived in 428. This is based on the assumption that the seventh year in chapter 7, 7 through 8 is an error for 37 year, a purely gratuitous assumption. The four principal arrangements of the non-traditional sequence are as follows. 1. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt its walls, yet it seems that when Ezra returned, the walls were standing. But Ezra's words, God has given us a wall of protection in Judah and Jerusalem, Ezra 9:9, can hardly be taken literally since there were no walls around Judah. In addition, Ezra employs the word gader for wall, whereas the usual word to describe Jerusalem's wall is choma. There is every reason to believe, however, that some kind of literal wall indeed existed in Jerusalem just before Nehemiah's return, where he's surprised to learn that it has been destroyed, Nehemiah 1, 3 through 4. Why would he have been upset to learn 140 years after the event that Nebuchadnezzar had broken down the city walls? It is inconceivable that Nehemiah knew nothing of this. The wall he mentions must be a wall that he thought was standing in his own day. Number 2. Ezra and Nehemiah seem not to be aware of each other's existence and certainly give no evidence of being contemporaries. The three passages where they do appear together, Nehemiah 8:9, 12:6, 36, are merely later glosses. That's the claim. The latter part of the argument is without textual support, and it's a classic instance of begging the question. The former part, therefore, no longer has any force, since Nehemiah does in fact mention Ezra. Ezra's failure to mention Nehemiah is clearly because he has completed most of the major tasks in the 13 years before Nehemiah arrived. Besides, it was common for contemporaries not to speak of one another. This can be illustrated by Haggai, Zechariah, Isaiah, Micah, and a host of other examples. Wishing to respect the text and Nehemiah referring to Ezra, Bright concedes that the two were contemporaries, but still maintains that Nehemiah was earlier. He also proposes the chronological rearrangement of the historical material. In the traditional interpretation, Ezra returned to 458, Ezra 7 and 8. When informed that many members of the holy race had intermarried with their pagan neighbors, Ezra led his people in a prayer confession, Ezra 9 and 10. Then in 445, after Nehemiah had returned and rebuilt the walls in Jerusalem, Ezra read the law to the Israelites, Nehemiah 8, who thereupon confessed their sins and promised to obey the commands of God, Nehemiah 9 and 10. Bright counters that since Ezra was commissioned by Artaxerxes to teach the law, Ezra 7, the reading of the law must have occurred soon after Ezra's arrival. Moreover, the tractability of the people when confronted with their mixed marriages, Ezra 10, and their readiness to conform to the law suggested his public reading had already taken place. Accordingly, Bright suggested upon arrival in Jerusalem in 428, Ezra proceeded to read the law. He then confronted the people on the issue of mixed marriages, and they confessed their sin and swore obedience to the covenant. Bright's proposal would be attractive except that it requires adding 30 to both Ezra 7:7 and 7:8. It is argued that the passage originally read that Ezra came up to Jerusalem in the 37th year of Artaxerxes, that is, in 428. According to the chronology, Nehemiah first arrived in 445, went back to Susa in 433, and then on his return to Jerusalem a few years later, met Ezra for the first time. As one as much might wish for such a solution, one must find a way to achieve it otherwise than through arbitrary manipulation of the text. Number 3. Ezra appears to have dealt with the intermarriage problem with much greater severity and finality than did Nehemiah. It is alleged that Nehemiah was too lenient, demanding only that in the future the Jews not give their children in marriage to foreigners, Nehemiah 13, whereas Ezra insisted that the marriages already entered upon terminated, Ezra 10, but this is extremely tenuous evidence. If, as the traditional view maintains, Ezra's reform occurred after 457 and Nehemiah's about 430 after his return from Susa, the 25 years between them would have been ample time for mixed marriages to become a problem all over again. Furthermore, it's arbitrary to argue that one measure was sterner or more decisive than the other. Ezra and Nehemiah each responded to the particular situation they faced, which measures appropriate to the situation and to the perceived problem. Number 4. The high priest contemporary with Nehemiah was Eliashib. Nehemiah 3:1, 20-21, 13:28. But Ezra retired to the chambers of Jehonathan, the son of Eliashib. Ezra 10:6. How could Ezra have preceded Nehemiah when he found a bow with the son of the priest in Nehemiah's day? This argument draws upon Nehemiah 12, where the priestly line is instead of Jeshua, Jehoiakim, Eliashib, Joiada, Jonathan, a variation of Jehonathan as in Johanan, and Jeduah. Here it is clear that Johanan is the grandson of Eliashib, not the son, which only exacerbates the problem. Furthermore, uh, Johanan appears in the Elephantine Papyri as the high priest of Jerusalem in the 70th year of Darius II. This would be 407, 50 years after the traditional date of Ezra's arrival in Jerusalem and his reformation. He must therefore have returned to the 7th year of Artaxerxes II, 398, and not the 7th year of Artaxerxes I. In response, one should note that Eliashib of Ezra 10:6 is not called a priest, and so may not be the Eliashib of Nehemiah's time. Also, Johanan is the son of Eliashib in Ezra, but the grandson in Nehemiah. Josephus reports that this grandson of Eliashib slew his brother Jeshua when Bigvai, Nehemiah's successor as governor, tried to install Jeshua as high priest. It is difficult to believe that Ezra felt comfortable enough with this character to share quarters with them. A similarly attractive proposal to harmonize the evidence is that of Frank Cross, who suggests that there's a haplography in the priestly genealogies, Nehemiah 12. He posits an original list in which there were two Eliashibs and two Johanans, one pair in Ezra's time and another in Nehemiah's. The problem with this suggestion is that there's no manuscript support for this, and therefore it's pure conjecture. Although it would alleviate the problem of the sequence of Ezra and Nehemiah, one cannot reconstruct texts on the basis of what would support a historical hypothesis. In light of the lengthy examination of the evidence, it seems clear that the traditional view that Ezra preceded Nehemiah has the most to commend it. It is not without its problems, but it provides a comfortable structure against which the narrative of both books may be understood. Ezra the priest and the scribe. Okay. Ezra received permission from Artaxerxes I to lead an exilic band back to Jerusalem. The Persian king authorized him to do virtually whatever he desired in the Trans-Euphrates provinces, including Judah. It will be helpful to see if there were any political factors that motivated Artaxerxes to this beneficent policy, for it is difficult to believe that the king was operating out of the purely charitable motives. As already suggested, the neutralization of the Delian League after 460 left Artaxerxes free to deal with the matters close to home. He instructed Megabos, an official who had bribed Sparta to attack Athens and had then been made governor of the satrapy of Syria, to lead Persian troops south for Cilicia to wage war on Egypt, the ally of Athens. After defending Athenian troops at Prospectus, an island in the Nile Delta, Megabossos brought Egypt itself to submission in 456. Thus, in 458, Artaxerxes may well have viewed the loyal Judean province as an important asset for its anticipated disciplinary action against Egypt. And what better way to ensure Judean loyalty than to allow Ezra, no doubt a highly popular and powerful Jewish leader, to reestablish Jewish life and culture in the Little Land, which was so crucial to Persia's success? After assembling at the Ahava Canal the caravan of those making the long journey to Jerusalem, Ezra led them in fasting and prayer, and then distributed among the leading priests and Levites the treasures he had collected from the king and the Jewish communities. Ezra 8. When they arrived at the holy city, they offered burnt offerings to Yahweh and proceeded to the task of rebuilding the Reformation. The temple had been completed 58 years before, but since the time spiritual and moral decline had set in, Ezra was confronted with the need for the immediate major steps to purify the religious and social life of the young community. The first item on the agenda was the question of intermarriage. Ezra learned that the people, priests, and Levites included, had engaged in mixed marriages and the surrounding pagan peoples, an act of contradiction, Mosaic teaching, Deuteronomy 7. So distraught was he that he went into a deep grief and mourning and sought the face of God, Ezra 9. God had been faithful in preserving a little remnant for the judgment and destruction and captivity. But now, Ezra lamented the remnant of itself with the danger of forfeiting its privileges as the people of God. like their ancestors under Joshua almost a millennium before. They were entering unholy alliances with the people of the land. If the Lord did not forgive them the sin, there would be no hope of their continuing as a covenant nation before Him. The popular response was that Ezra had prayed. The people repented, and the priests and the other leaders with them reaffirmed the commitment to the covenant pledge to be pure and holy people. 3 days later, all the men of the nation gathered at Jerusalem and they received instruction about dissolving their illegal marriages. Although the record is unclear, we would assume that the individuals guilty of intermarriage divorced their foreign mates. Yet the need for similar action 25 years later under Nehemiah suggests the contrary. Nehemiah the governor. If it was Arnold, it'd be the governor. Let me get some water. Remember, guys, y'all could ask questions. I'm just reading to get my seminary reading done. And in the meantime, y'all asking questions. All right. Got the water. Here we go. Nehemiah the governor. Governor. Nothing more was known of the ministry of Ezra after his first year in Judah until the arrival of Nehemiah in 445, 13 years later. There were no doubt difficult years for Ezra, both from internal domestic causes and from the unremitting harassment of the Samaritans and others who opposed the privileging status of the Jewish state. The situation that prompted Nehemiah to go to Jerusalem testified eloquently that Ezra's problems and what Nehemiah found when he arrived there only confirmed them. After megabazos, the Syrian governor, thank you for the membership, rapping the Bible. Well, yeah, well, this is not the Bible, but it is about. Am I having a good time in seminary? Studying the Bible is fun. I enjoy writing papers, but I don't enjoy deadlines. I don't enjoy things like that. So, no, I'm not having a good time. I'm thankful for it, but it's work. After Megabazos, the Syrian governor, subdued Egypt, he took the Greek and Egyptian commanders with him to Susa under promise of protection there. For several years the promise was kept, but in 449, Amestris, the widow of Xerxes and queen mother, demanded their execution. The fulfillment of her demand so infuriated Megabazos that he fled Susa, returned to Syria, and from there declared the independence of the Trans-Euphratean satrapy. He had sufficient following to repel at least 2 campaigns against him, but then having made his point, he returned to Susa and declared his fealty once more to the Persian crown. The relevance of this to the narrative of Nehemiah's journey to Jerusalem is that the Syro-Palestinian satrapy was in a very precarious position as far as that of Xerxes was concerned. He knew that what had happened once could happen again and that he might be able to recover the rebellious territories the next time. I think my foot is hitting the camera foot. Alright, let's see. I might be unable to recover. Clearly, he was willing to do anything that might consolidate his position and ensure continued loyalty from his volatile subjects. When Nehemiah volunteered to go to Jerusalem to stabilize the situation there, Artaxerxes saw in the request not only a way to accede to the heartfelt burden of his beloved cupbearer for his Jewish kinfolk, but also a way to place someone over Judah whom he could trust to remain loyal to Persia and to achieve a climate of tranquility and order. Megabazos had revolted in 449 and reasserted his loyalty about 2 years later. Nehemiah requested permission to go to Jerusalem in 445. The 20th year of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah 2:1, one may assume the conditions throughout the Syro-Palestinian Palestine were chaotic after 449, and there were desperate need for strong leadership there. Particularly hard hit was Judah, for not only must it have suffered the ravages of rebellion and counter-rebellion, but also it was constantly under attack, verbally if not physically, from the Samaritans and their allies. The report of the broken walls of Jerusalem reflects something of the devastation that the city suffered during the chaotic years. Hey Simon, what's up? Uh, yeah, yeah. Kurt streams on his own channel now, so that's y'all subscribe to him. and he'll continue doing what he's doing. All right. Nehemiah is one of the most inspiring figures of the biblical history, as was the case with many talented and ambitious Jews of the diaspora. He had risen through the ranks of government, eventually achieving the position of cupbearer to the king. There had to be an implicit trust between the two, for the cupbearer could be bribed to slip poison into the king's goblet or do him other harm. But in spite of this intense loyalty to his king, Nehemiah had a higher loyalty, that is to God. Although he had never been to Jerusalem, his heart was there, and like Daniel, he must have prayed every day with his face towards Zion. No, I'm not getting my PhD. I finished my Master's of Biblical Studies, and I need 13 more classes to finish my Master's of Theology. I was working on multiple degrees at once. In 445, Nehemiah's brother Hanin, Han, Han, Hanani, Hanani maybe, and several other travelers returned from journey to Jerusalem. Nehemiah 1. Whether they had been on an inspection tour for the king cannot be determined. In any case, they reported to Nehemiah the wreckage and despair they saw everywhere in the holy city. This was so heavily weighed on the pious zealot that he fasted and prayed for many days, reminding the Lord of the promises to restore and prosper his dispersed people. Nehemiah asked that he might find favor in the eyes of the king and be allowed to participate in Jerusalem's renewal in some way. Artaxerxes soon noticed Nehemiah's crestfallen condition and inquired as to its cause. When he found out, he at once authorized Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem and gave him royal letters granting him safe conduct and whatever materials were necessary to the task of rebuilding. When he arrived, Nehemiah found the situation even worse than he imagined. The walls and other structures lay in ruins, and the rulers of the adjacent districts were adamantly opposed to the reconstruction. One of these rulers, Sanballat the Horonite, Horonite, right? It's not the horny knight, the Horonite, is attested to in the Aramaic papyri Elephatine as having been governor of Samaria in the 17th year of Darius II, that is in 407. Since by then he had adult sons, it's reasonable to believe that he had been governor 40 years earlier. Tobiah the governor, Layman, is less well known. Geshem the Arab, the third principal antagonist, however, is documented outside the Bible. The primary source of information is a silver bowl discovered in 1947, year before Israel became a nation, as Tel El Maskuta in Lower Egypt. Like three other such bowls, it has a dedicated inscription to the goddess Han Elat, and in addition to the line that was Kanu, son of Gasmu, king of Kedar, brought in offering to Han Elat. Gasmu is the biblical Geshem. On the basis of the particular Aramaic writing, the nature of the bowl, the Athenian coins discovered at the same site, the inscription has been dated to around 400. Okay, so they found the bowl, they found the Athenian coins at the same place, and therefore they knew how old it was. All right. The major resistance of this antagonist was not to the establishment of the code of Yahweh. The reason for the opposition by the same people 75 years earlier, Ezra 5:3, but to the reestablishment of Judah as a viable and powerful rival to their own principalities. They had no doubt sided with Bezos in his, I'm thinking of, what's his name that owns Amazon? What's his, Basil? What's his name? Beza? I can't remember. Anyway, no doubt sided with Megabossos in his rebellion and how uh, correctly saw Nehemiah as a strong pro-Persian sent among them to police the region as the henchman of Artaxerxes himself. They that they dared to interfere with Nehemiah's project shows a certain residue of independence from Persia, especially since the content of Artaxerxes' letter of authorization was well known to them. Nehemiah wasted no time. Within 3 days, he undertook a complete survey of the perimeter of the city to determine the course of the walls and steps necessary to the reconstruction. At once, the Jewish leaders concurred with Nehemiah on what had to be done, and the task commenced without further ado. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, after a futile attempt to impede the work by mockery, suggested the Jews were being disloyal to the king, and assert charge in light of Artaxerxes' memorandum. As the work proceeded apace, they became alarmed, for the closing up of the city walls meant that Jerusalem soon would be impregnable to military threat. A defensible Jewish capital to them was an ominous sign of Jewish independence and eventual Jewish domination of the entire region. Perhaps a revival of the Davidic Empire was not far-fetched after all. It was in line with the Jewish prophetic expectation. Nehemiah therefore was forced to defend the work from interruption even as the building continued. When taunted and ridicule failed, the opposition resorted to pleas for negotiations, during the course of which they would assassinate Nehemiah. Sanballat and Geshem particularly were intent on persuading Nehemiah to meet with them on the plain of Ono, Kafir Ana, just 10 miles east of Joppa. 5 times they communicated with him. The fifth time took the form of a letter from Sanballat accusing Nehemiah of having monarchical ambitions in violation of his commitment to Artaxerxes, Nehemiah 6. Sanballat then hinted that he would not disclose such treachery to the Persian king if Nehemiah would agree to meet with them and work out an accommodation. Nehemiah firmly rejected this overture as a fabricated designation to lure him from the city and expose him to assassination, but the intrigue was not yet over. Shemaiah ben Deliah, a fifth columnist hired by Tobiah and Sanballat, pleaded with Nehemiah to seek sanctuary in the temple to protect himself against a supposed band of thugs who were intent on murdering him. Chapter 6. Nehemiah once realized that such a display of the cowardice would undermine Jewish morale and discredit him in the eyes of the people. He therefore rejected that option as well and cast himself upon the Lord for encouragement and strength. After only 52 days, the walls were completed. Their course and the extent of urban area they enclosed cannot be determined today because of archaeological inaccessibility. For the best interpretation of the data provided by Nehemiah is that the post-exilic Jerusalem was very small, even smaller than the pre-exilic city. It was only after the Maccabean enlargement of the city in the 2nd century BC that it approached its earlier size. Nevertheless, the completion of the project completely demoralized the enemies of the Jews, where they saw in it the handiwork of God. Uh, Once the city was secured, Nehemiah set about an even more important task of recognizing the government and effecting the sorely needed spiritual and moral reformation. His first appointed doorkeepers, singers, and other Levitical personnel and designated his brother Hananiah mayor of the city. He then began to address economic problems. The prophet Haggai had pointed out an acquisitive mentality among some of the people, a selfish attention to their own enhancement at the expense of the temple and the poor. I'll talk about that later if we get into Haggai. They were basically building their houses with gold, while the temple lay, in ruins, basically, think, or in bad shape. This same spirit prevailed throughout the years of Ezra's leadership and now confronted Nehemiah as well. The problem had been exacerbated by both the civil war instigated by Megabazos and, is it Steve Bezos, the Amazon guy? Megabazos, okay. And it sounds like I'm saying mega balls. Mega balzos. All right. Mega balzos. And the constant interference of the Samaritans and their allies. Uh, this mega balzos must have had mega bars. The near siege of Jerusalem during the weeks of construction only added to the misery, for food was running low and those in a position to supply were holding out for exorbitant prices. Do you do Benny's, Charles, or on your website? What is Benny's on your website? I don't have a website. Some of the Jews were forced to mortgage their properties to purchase food, and others to borrow to pay the Persian. I wonder if you mean cookies. Unable to repay what they had borrowed, they had been forced to deliver the sons and daughters over to the creditors and indentured slaves. It was shameful that those who were profiting at the expense of the poor were not the heathen of the land, but wealthy Jews. They were enslaving their own brothers and sisters at the same time. The community funds were being used to redeem Jews from indentured to Gentiles. Nehemiah 5. Infuriated, Nehemiah demanded that these usurious practices cease and that all persons and properties be released at once. Some more water. No, we don't have any merch set up. We're not there yet. Nehemiah next attempted to distribute the population more evenly throughout the land. Apparently, most of the returnees had settled in the villages and towns where the Babylonian destruction had been minimal. Jerusalem was virtually abandoned because of the massive devastation there. Now that the temple and the walls had been restored, it was necessary for private housing to be built and for the sparsely populated city to be settled. The plan devised by Nehemiah was to research the genealogical records and require those who were Jerusalem-like descent to move there. Finally, when the seventh month of the year arrived, Nehemiah assembled all the people of Jerusalem to celebrate the autumn festivals. On the first day of the month, wake up, wake up, cast your chest and get up. On the first day of the month, the day of the new year, Ezra stood to read the Torah to the masses gathered before him. When some began to weep, Nehemiah urged them to rejoice instead, for this was a day holy to Yahweh. Then they began to build booths in accordance with the instructions for the Feast of Tabernacles. When the 15th day of the month arrived, and then in the week-long celebration commemorating God's wondrous provision for his people in the wilderness as he led them to the promised land. All the while Ezra read from the sacred scrolls, and the people rejoiced in the new exodus and preservation. On the 24th day of the seventh month, Nehemiah called a special assembly devoted to covenant reaffirmation. The covenant text is in the form of a prayer that begins by extolling Yahweh as a creator. He alone is God. It next addresses him as the God of history who elected Abraham and the fathers and promised him the land of Canaan as the inheritance. He redeemed his oppressed people from Egyptian slavery by many deeds, gave them a law in Sinai after chastening them for their disobedience in the wilderness, and last brought them into the land he had promised to give them. Yet they continued to sin until they were uprooted from the land and taken captive by the foreign nations. But God was gracious and merciful and restored them once more to the land. Finally, the prayer petitions Yahweh to regard the contrition and respond to their need. They are back in the land indeed, but they remain a vassal people to an alien king. 9. With the commitment solemnly recited, the leaders put it in writing and set their signatures to the document. Binding themselves with the curse and the oath, all the people likewise affirmed their intention to observe the covenant requirements. Specifically, they pledged to avoid intermarriage with pagans, to observe the Sabbath, to pay the temple taxes, to follow the regulations concerning tithing and the offering of the firstborn, to be faithful to the ministry of the temple of God. These events all appear to have transpired in 1 year, 1445. Remember the decree, the one I memorized is 1444. The events all appear to have transpired in 1 year, 445. The first year Nehemiah was in Jerusalem. He remained there for 12 years and then returned to Susa for a brief period. It was evidently during the years of absence, 433 to 430, that the population redistribution that Nehemiah had authorized was carried out. This may have been the occasion when the priest Eliashib moved into Jerusalem. In an event when Nehemiah returned from Susa, he found Eliashib there, and much was discussed, his old foe Tobiah as well. Tobiah was related by marriage to some of Jerusalem's leading citizens, and had managed to take advantage of these connections to move into the temple precincts themselves. Nehemiah's reaction is predictable. He ordered Tobiah thrown out of the chambers where he had been staying purified. It is not known what pressing business called Nehemiah back in Susa in 433. It may be simply that his leave of absence had expired and then returned to renew it. In any case, he did not remain there very long, but long enough for all kinds of problems to reappear. Besides the harboring of Tobiah and Eliashib's temple quarters, Nehemiah found that the Levites had been neglected. The Sabbath was being violated, and the old nemesis of intermarriage was once more in full vogue. One of the sons of Jehoiada, the priest, had been married to the daughter of Sanballat. Nehemiah once more was forced to effect sweeping changes. He dedicated the wall probably on the anniversary of its construction, and took the occasion and an opportunity to establish a system that will provide for the Levites out of the offerings of the people, as the law required. He also had the Mosaic stipulation read concerning the exclusion of foreigners, particularly Ammonite and Moabites, from the sacred assembly of Israel. This, no doubt, was in response to the presence of Tobiah the Ammonite in the temple courts. Nehemiah then addressed the matter with Sabbath breaking and laid out strict guidelines that were to be followed by Jew and Gentile alike if they wished to avoid divine judgment and his personal wrath. Finally, Nehemiah rebuked their guilty of proper marriage, even lashing out at them physically and warning them the continuation of the practice would invite his further displeasure and that of the Lord. Malachi the prophet. So now we're going into Malachi, guys. Malachi the prophet. The final source of Old Testament historical information from a contemporary is the prophet Malachi. Little is known of him, even his name perhaps, but it is clear that his ministry preceded by some years the ministry of Ezra and the governorship of Nehemiah. The lack of reference to Ezra and Nehemiah and the fact that Malachi inveighed against the very abuses in religious and social life that these two addressed after the mid-5th century suggests that Malachi uttered his oracles earlier at that time, perhaps as early as 480 to 470 BC or thereabout. The number I remember was 425 BC. That was supposed to be when the silent years began. The great burden of the prophet is covenant violation. God has loved his people, Malachi said, but they failed to apprehend this love and indeed rewarded with dishonor and disobedience, Malachi 1. This was manifested in their hypocritical offering of maimed and diseased animals to the Lord, while their priests turned from the teaching of Torah and violated the covenant of Levi. Moreover, many of the Jews, disregarding the marriage vows, had divorced their legitimate wives, thus signaling their utter contempt for the covenant were by God and married them to himself. As a result, the Lord would send his messianic messenger both to purge the evil from the covenant people and to purify a remnant that would walk before him in truth. On that day, Malachi asserts the Son of Righteousness would rise with healing in his wings, and the Lord would turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Thus will be achieved the eternal purposes of God that will bring history to its consummation by the great climatic act of redemption and restoration in his beloved Son. The history of Old Testament Israel closes with the last chapter of Second Chronicles. Yeah, he went up. Go up. It's an exhortation to go up. The last book of the Old Testament canon, but the history of Israel as a kingdom of priests does not end there. In this respect, the Old Testament is not a closed book, but one open-ended to the purposes of God, as reflected in the New Testament purposes to be realized in the church and in the eschatological Israel. On a Our account has attempted to view the history of Israel not just as a social political phenomenon, but also an outworking of the redemptive plan of the Lord, that is, as a theological message. The world of humanity, alienated from God by the fall, is still the object of his love and grace. The Old Testament tells the story of the implementation of this grace through the vehicle of an elect man, Abraham, who gave rise to an elect nation, Israel, a kingdom of priests whose task was to demonstrate microcosmically what it means to be the redeemed people of God and be the mediator to the world of his saving revelation. The nation failed miserably in Old Testament times, but a remnant still continues to bear witness to the unfailing covenant and commitment of the Lord to seek out a people for his name. The kingdom of priests then is not a relic of ancient times and distant places, but is an ongoing manifestation of the gracious purpose of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then he has a bibliography. But I have to read backwards. Some of y'all that's gonna frustrate, but because I got to get all the reading done. So the exile and the first return is where I'm going to read now. An introductory overview. The course of the deportations. Am I a pastor or want to be? I'm a Bible teacher. If there's a church that wants what I do, then and it's God's will, then so be it. But my passion is to teach other Christians, to teach other ministers. Alright. An introductory overview, the course of the deportations. The first submission of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 605 BC ushered in the period described by Jeremiah as the 70th year captivity, a period that began in the year and ended with the overflow of Babylon in 539. Alright, 605, remember I talked about that one before. So at 539, being in the year, okay. So I mentioned 586 earlier, but it's basically saying that the captivity, or the 70-year captivity was over in 539. Alright. These long years in which the leader Judeans' social and religious life were absent from the homeland are more properly called the exile in the modern literature, a singularly appropriate term since it not only suggests the forceful removal of the Jewish population of Babylon, but also poignantly communicates the absence of Yahweh as well. The real strategy of the exile was not the removal of the people or even the utter destruction of the city and temple. It was the departure of their God from their midst and absence symbolized in one of Ezekiel's visions by the movement of the Shekinah from the temple to submit to the summit of the Mount of Olives. In a certain sense, therefore, the end of the Jewish captivity in 539 to 538 was not synonymous with the end of the exile, for Yahweh did not return at that time to inhabit a new temple. Rather, the prophets predicted that he will return only in the eschatological age when Messiah himself will be the glory of the Lord. And that's in Haggai chapter 2. The first phase of Judah's exile was approximately coincided with accession of Nebuchadnezzar, 605 to 562, to the throne of Babylon. The young prince, having engaged in the Egyptians in battles at Carchemish in 605 and defeated them there, was deflected by the untimely death of his father from his further objective of removing them from Palestine. He did succeed, however, in sacking Jerusalem and in taking Jewish prisoners back to his capital. He left Jehoiakim, a king of Judah, a move that proved unwise, for Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylonian overlordship, and Nebuchadnezzar found it necessary to return in about 601. He returned again in 597 after Jehoiachin, son of Jehoiakim, came to the throne. Nebuchadnezzar sent the young king into exile, where he remained until his death. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah, brother of Jehoiakim, on the throne. The arrangement too proved to be politically unsound, because of Zedekiah's refractoriness, and so Nebuchadnezzar came one more, this time utterly demolishing Jerusalem and the temple and carrying the upper strata of Israelite society into exile in 586, which I mentioned earlier. Life in the diaspora. The state of affairs lasted until the first return of the exile shortly after Cyrus' decree of liberation in 538. The exile period was thus in the main from 586 to 538. Biblical and extra-biblical sources reveal little of the conditions of Palestine during that time, but the evidence indicates a rather pessimistic situation overall. The Jewish exiles who had gone to Egypt either before or during the deportations of Nebuchadnezzar appear to have fared much better, but again the sources are meager, almost completely confined to one site, Elephantine. On the other hand, we are much better informed concerning Jewish life in Babylon. The biblical literature often hints here and there that life on the whole was pleasant and the people adjusted remarkably well to this new locale. This judgment is confirmed by the few cuneiform records and testify to Jewish life. Yehezekiel Kaufman argues that there's no evidence of the anti-Semitism among the Babylonians, and that in fact the Jews frequently enjoyed economic well-being and even rose to high political office. In any case, it's clear that by the time of the decree of Cyrus, most of the exiled Jews were of the generation that had never known the motherland firsthand. That is, they had been born in exile, and although they thought the dreamed of Jerusalem, they were very much people of Babylon. The older generation, the idealists among them, longed for home. But it's a striking fact that Sheshabar, Zerubbabel, and other leaders of the first return apparently were unable to recruit a majority of the Jews to accompany them back to Judah. This is understandable given the relatively hospitable way of life in Babylon and grim prospects of beginning life again in the land of death and ashes. But the real point is the adaptability, the assimilability of the people by and large. Like countless other refugees and displaced peoples before and after them, they demonstrated the flexibility of the human psyche by not only remaining in the land, but also allowing the land to penetrate and remain in them. To argue that the Jews, as committed as they were and are to community and tradition, could live under the relatively favorable conditions of Babylonian exile and not be absorbed by them a large measure is to naively assume a stubborn tenacity or rigid isolationism alien to what little was known about Judah in exile. The Jews, ever an adaptable and yet cohesive people, have historically demonstrated the desire and ability to have good citizens of whatever land they inhabit. This extends to military service, education, culture, and not least language. It is unreasonable that the contrary to the evidence assumed that the Jews of the Babylonian exile were isolated by either coercion or choice, physically or intellectually. They imbibed deeply of the society in which they lived, yet they retained the cherished faith, life, traditions of their ancestors. The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel reveal an acute awareness of the two. The ancient ways of the Jews' ancestors in the New World in which they participated in whose images, metaphors, and whose pattern of their life they could bend to their holy purposes. They spoke to a people who were immersed in the culture of the time and place. How better to communicate the eternal purposes of God for his people as well for Babylon than in the idiom of which they have become so intimately familiar? Should we indeed expect anything less of the prophets, that they were men of the times that spoke to and about the community in words and language that people could understand? The language certainly was Hebrew throughout, but it was Hebrew everywhere imbued with lexical and literary nuances whose source cannot be doubted. Babylonia and its rich inventory of cultural and religious expression. Okay, the return from exile. In God's time, the exile extended the return was undertaken, albeit not without difficulty. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562, an event that precipitated the rapid demise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire that paved the way for a replacement by Cyrus and the Persians. Nebuchadnezzar's son and successor, the ineffectual evil Merodach, 562 to 560, is known primarily as the ruler who released Jehoiachin Judah from confinements and provided him with the royal pension until his death. Next to rule was Neriglissar, 560 to 556, brother-in-law of evil Merodach, who did nothing to forestall the collapse of the empire, nor did his ill-fated son Labashi Marduk. The latter was murdered by the forces determined to reduce the power of the god Marduk. They in turn seated Nabonidus 539 on the throne. His devotion to the moon god Sin, whose cult centers were at Ur and Haran, alienated him from both the clergy and the populace of Babylon, where Marduk worship were centralized. And the fiction was floated that Marduk himself was displeased, as various descriptions informed us, and began to seek a means of dispossession Nabonidus, and finding the shepherd would more faithfully would tend the Babylonian flock. Such a shepherd was Cyrus of Anshan, who, after subduing the Medes and all of the rivals, had created the most powerful political and military force the world had seen up to that time. So we're talking about the Assyrians right now. After a succession of the lightning-like strokes against enemies far and near, Cyrus was able to encircle and take Babylon with virtually no resistance in 539. Okay, so, wait a minute. Cyrus is not Assyria. Why would I say that? Now I'm second guessing. I'm third guessing myself right now. I'll just keep going. Let's see. Cyrus is able to take Babylon with virtually no resistance of 539. Nabonidus. Okay, so yeah, but he's Persian. Nabonidus had made a habit of absenting himself from the capital, even on especially at New Year's, when it was customary for the king to participate at the principal and traditional rites. These absences were so frequent and long-lasting that de facto control was placed in the hands of his son Belshazzar. It was his unfortunate vice-regent who presided over the collapse of the city and nation upon the arrival of Gurbu, the Persian commander and governor of Gutium. Belshazzar apparently died during or shortly after this conflict, and Nabonidus was captured and immediately thereafter paroled. 2 weeks later, Cyrus triumphantly marched to the city to celebrate the final step in his attainment of virtually universal hegemony. Cyrus followed the enlightened and beneficent policy of permitting all captive peoples to return to their homes. The Jews were included in sowing this decree, the blessing of God, and fulfilling his prophetic word. To them, the deliverance was no less meaningful and miraculous than was the exodus from Egypt under Moses. Indeed, the language of the prophets, for example, in Isaiah 40 through 66, is filled with motifs reminiscent of the Exodus. The majority of the exilic community may have comfortably settled in Babylon, but those with an eye to the eternal purposes of God saw in the captivity a judgment, and in the prospects of return a sure sign that God was not through with his people. They had a redemptive role yet to play. The world situation during the exile, the decline and fall of Babylonia. Get some more water. All right. Within a year of the conquest of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the island portion of Tyre and bringing Sidon and Arvid and the mainland portion of Tyre under his control. The language lasted 13 years, but even after the island finally surrendered in about 573, the Babylonians had little to show for their efforts. As a kind of compensation, Nebuchadnezzar moved south in Egypt into 568, and according to some texts and traditions, wrought havoc in various places of the land. It's getting hot right now. I need to make sure my fan is pointed at my air conditioner so that it works right. Let's see. In the extra biblical sources, the remaining years of Nebuchadnezzar's life were shrouded in mystery. He died in 562 and was succeeded by his son, evil Merodach, as As already noted, evil Merodach was responsible for the release of Jehoiachin from imprisonment. Otherwise, the record of his reign is cast in a rather negative light. In 560, he was assassinated by Nerigalisser, his sister's husband. Nerigalisser managed to undertake at least one major campaign across the Taurus mountain range, an action taken perhaps to counteract the Median advance into central Anatolia, and was also completed impressive building projects. His tenure, however, was brief, 560 to 556. His young son, Labashi Marduk, who succeeded him, reigned only 1 month before he was beaten to death. The role that Nabonidus played in the death of Labashi Marduk is not clear, but he found himself on Babylonia's throne in succession to the dynasty of the Nabopolassar, which had lasted for exactly 70 years. Nabonidus was the son of the nobleman named Nabu Balatsu Ikbi and of Adagupi, a high priestess of the moon god. The latter, an influential cultic leader who lived more than 100 years, made a profound impact on the religious life of her son and so played a crucial role in the eventual fall of Babylon. If Nabonidus is the same as the high official of the name in Nebuchadnezzar's 80th year, 597, he must have been advanced in years by 555. This is possible in light of the fact that his mother, who died at 547, was born at 650. Some scholars also equate Nabonidus with Lebentius, who mediated the dispute between the Lydian and the Medes in 585. Nabonidus, influenced by his mother, was a pious devotee of the moon god Sin. As long as he had mere citizen, even if an important one, this caused no difficulty. When he became king of Babylonia, however, the situation radically changed, for Babylon was a city dedicated to the worship of Marduk, chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon. At once, a conflict arose that would spell the disastrous ruin not only of Nabonidus but of the entire Babylonian Empire. The crisis was not long in coming, for in his accession year, Nabonidus claimed to have had a dream in which Marduk told him to rebuild the decrepit temple of Sin, the so-called Ihuhu. This was an attempt by the new king to justify the introduction of the worship of Sin into the religious jurisdiction of Marduk and to ally the suspicions of both priests and people to its propriety. So syncretism. Syncretisms among pagans. In the first full year, 555, Nabonidus, after at least temporarily pacifying his critics, undertook his first campaign and moved to the northwest, resulting in the conquest of Hamath and Haran. In the third year, he was again in Syria, succeeding in taking other cities in the region. Of particular interest to him was Haran, which, along with the ancient city of was the center of the worship of Sin. He had previously forged a treaty with Cyrus against the Medes, who were then in possession of Haran. The Medes had thereupon vacated the city to engage the Persians in battle, thus providing Nabonidus an opportunity to move in and claim it for himself. And once Nabonidus commenced the restoration of Haran as a cult center, he erected a great statue of the moon god and rebuilt the temple. That's what it looks like. This only exacerbated the suspicions, the hostilities of the Babylonian clergy, for it had become apparent to them that Nabonidus was not attempting just to elevate Sid to a higher rank, but was intent on substituting him for Marduk altogether. The situation became so uncomfortable that Nabonidus said in the 6th year, 550, he went into the 10-year self-imposed exile at Tema, the great oasis of the Syro-Arabian desert seat of the Red Sea, east of the Red Sea. Nabonidus did not abdicate, but left the everyday affairs of the government in the hands of the son Belshazzar. Documentation is limited for the period as a whole, but it is clear that Nabonidus occupied himself in military activity in his years away from Babylon, particularly against Arabian tribes that were becoming increasingly visible and troublesome. He also cultivated their interest in antiquities, collecting and restoring objects of art and rebuilding fallen temples and other ancient structures. As for Belshazzar, virtually nothing is known of him until the fateful night of 539 when he foresaw his imminent downfall. While Nabonidus spent 10 years in Tema, Cyrus busily occupied its mass in the empire. Soon after that was left to incorporate into his vast realm was Babylon, and he set his sights upon the prize. In the fall of 539, he took the city of Opus and Tigris. A few days later, on October 10th, he took Sippar without opposition. Nabonidus, meanwhile, had returned to Babylon just in time to witness the collapse of the glorious city and its capture without resistance by Kuburbu, a governor of Gutium and commander of the Persian army. This took place on October 12th. 2 weeks later, on October 29th, 539. Cyrus himself entered the city in peace. He forbade destruction, appointed uh, governor, governor, and left the religious and civil administration of Babylonian unchanged. The origins of the Persian Empire. Cyrus traced his roots to both the Medes and the Persians. Both were descendants of the Aryan tribal folk, having moved south to the Eritrean plateau from Russia in about 1000 BC and settled in the vicinity of Lake Urema, in which is now extreme northwestern Iran. Gradually, the Medes moved east and occupied West Iran south of the Caspian Sea, and the Persians migrated far to the southeast and settled in southwestern Iran toward the Persian Gulf. Table 9, the Persian kings. You got Cyrus II, 559 to 530, Cambyses the second, 530 to 522, Gamata, 522, Darius Histippus, 522 to 486, Xerxes, 486 to 465, Artaxerxes the first, 464 to 424, Darius the second, 423 to 404, and Artaxerxes the second, 404 to 358. Achaemenes, who ruled from about 700 to 675, founded the royal line of which Cyrus was a part. It was he who gave the name to the Achaemenid dynasty. His son Ctesippus in 675-640 extended the boundaries of the Persia as far south as Paragasidae. Because his realm was now so extensive, Ctesippus divided it between his two sons, Ariamis to the south and Cyrus the First in the north. He also regained his independence from the Medes, who had made Parsa a vassal state in about 670. The line Ariamis 640 to 615 included Arsames, Histippes, and Darius Histippes, and that of the Syrian of Cyrus the First, 640 to 600, produced Cambyses, 600 to 559, and Cyrus the Second, 559 to 530, the Cyrus who created the empire. Cambyses, who had placed over Persia after it once more became a Median province, married the daughter of the Median king Astyages. Cyrus II, the offspring of this marriage, united himself the royal houses of the Media and Persia. So we're in Daniel. The Median contemporary of the Persian Archimedes was Deioces, about whom little was known. Pheretos, his son, made Parsa a vassal. Already noted, but his death in battle against the Syrians in 653 helped Ctesippus regain independence. The Median throne remained vacant from 653 to 625 because of Scythian domination in northwest Iran, but in time, Cyaxares, 625 to 585, overthrew the Scythians, and the Assyrians established a Median control over all the northern Mesopotamia and Iran. He also reduced Persia to submission, setting up Cambyses as governor over the province. Cyaxares was succeeded by his son Astyages, 585-550, whose daughter would be the mother of the great Cyrus II. Cyrus himself was a vassal of his grandfather, ruling the region known as Anshan. He located this capital of the Paragasidae and began the process of unifying several Persian tribes that hitherto had resisted consolidation. He also made an alliance with Nabonidus of Babylonia, an arrangement that was tantamount to rebelling against the Astyages, since the Babylonians were now Media's bitter foes. Summoned to the imperial capital, Ecbatana, Cyrus refused to go. Astyages therefore launched an attack upon his willful grandson, but the old king's army defected. In a masterful stroke, Cyrus marched against Ecbatana, took Astyages prisoner, and made Media itself a Persian province. Cyrus at once laid claim to all Median territories, a claim that led to immediate confrontation with Lydia, a powerful kingdom on the Aegean Sea in western Assyrian Minor. Lydia was then under the leadership of Croesus, a monarch of almost legendary status in Greek classical literature. Yeah, I think he's in Homer. Croesus anticipated the world conquering aspiration. Let me see. There's a footnote there. Hmm. I don't know. I have to look it up. Croesus anticipated the world conquering aspirations of the far famed Persian and therefore marched east to prevent his arrival in the Hellenic sphere of influence. Cyrus, however, forced him back to his capital, Sardis, and therefore defeated him in 547. Cyrus informed Croesus' kingdom into a new Persian satrapy, Sarpada, and established friendly ties with the Greeks of the region, who later served him as allies and mercenaries. It can't be that guy because Homer went way before that time. Croesus. I'm gonna look him up real quick. I know my screen's gonna lag, but I'm gonna see who this dude is. Oh, his name's from Croesus. Croesus was the last king of Lydia from 585. Yeah, it's not the one I know of. Well, what's he famous for? Delphi. Conquest, other domain. Coinage. I'm seeing if he's been depicted in media stuff. Word get Persia. In popular culture. Isaac Watts made reference to him. Tolstoy. The Simpsons. um, yeah, a couple others are mentioned there. What did it say? Wizard of Oz, the single child of King Croesus. I've heard that name Croesus in another book, and I thought it was the same one, but I don't think it is. No, yeah, it can't be. It can't be the same one, or maybe I'm just imagining it. I don't know. Well, we checked. All right. Meanwhile, no, I didn't get a new computer. This is the old one. I'm streaming from my phone right now. So let me explain, Hudson. 3 years ago, Christian Brothers bought me a computer. So the warranty went out. Well, our church gave me an old computer around the same time. But it doesn't have much memory, it doesn't, I mean, so that's what I'm using as a spare. This thing won't even update to Windows 11. There's all kinds of other things that I can't do on it, you know. But I'm like I'm thankful that I'm able to write my seminary paper, and don't get me wrong, it freezes and I have to wait and all of that stuff when I'm dealing with Logos, and I got very little running on Logos, uh, but yeah, it can't sustain a stream. All right, let's see. Meanwhile, Babylonia, because of the absence of Nabonidus and Tema, began to deteriorate internally and externally under the incompetent Belshazzar. Many Babylonian provinces, such as Elam, fell away to Persia in 539. Cyrus sent an army under the general Guburu to invest Babylon. The city fell without a struggle, and Cyrus immediately made it the capital of yet another Persian satrapy, Barbus, which included Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine within its jurisdiction. One reason for the ready capitulation of Babylon to Cyrus was the bitter antagonism and the Babylonians felt toward Nabonidus and his son for their anti-Marduk religious posture. Cyrus had already gained a reputation as an enlightened ruler who was extremely lenient and eclectic in his viewpoint. He maintained the status quo in lands and felt to his control, at least as much as he could without jeopardizing his sovereignty. One feature of his policy was to recognize the claims of native gods or with their followers and to make no effort to supplant them with gods of his own. In fact, he came to Babylon to express wishes of Marduk himself, since Marduk had become angry at Nabonidus' irreverence and wished to replace him with another king, the shepherd who would be faithfully tend Marduk's human flock. This shepherd, of course, is Cyrus. Yeah, it's interesting. Around this time, I got a BibSac article um, where it talks about how the shepherd language was used for kings and as a backdrop for understanding the shepherd imagery for the Bible, like Psalms 23, other things like that. Cyrus' enlightened policy had directed bearing on the plight of the exilic Jewish community in Babylonia. For Cyrus, according to Yahweh their God, the same deference he paid to Marduk and all other deities. A logical outgrowth of this policy was his decree that the Jews be allowed to return to their homeland, which I believe is in 444. Let's see what they say. Only in a restored temple in Jerusalem could Yahweh function effectively as the God of Judah. Thus, in eager solicitation of the favor of Yahweh, Cyrus repatriated the Jewish people and provided them with the authorization uh, wherewithal to rebuild their city and temple as a fitting place for their God. After this decree in 538, so he's saying the decrees in 538. Like I said, this is a little bit older book. I have to look and see what we said in the lectures. I also want to check J. Paul Tanner because he's got lots of stuff in his Daniel commentary on this. After this decree in 538, Cyrus continued to maintain and even expand his magnificent empire. He died in 530 in combat against the Massagette in the Jaxartes River Valley in Central Asia. The Jewish people during the exile, Judah. In the middle of these earth-shaking events in the world of nations, God-elect people continued to maintain their identity. They're no longer as one nation in one place. The miserable remnant that had evaded the three deportations to Babylon in 605, 597, and 586. I know 605 and 586. I gotta remember 597. 597. As well as the flight to Egypt under Jehoiakim, number perhaps no more than 20,000 souls. I gotta take a heartburn pill. One second, guys. Man, acid. You said Toronto and Smokey having an OSAS discussion again? I think Toronto should have debated him. In the midst of these earth-shaking events in the world of nations, God's elect people continued to maintain their identity. They're no longer as one nation in one place. The miserable remnant that had evaded the three deportations to Babylon in 605, 597, and 586, as well as the flight to Egypt under Johannes, numbered perhaps no more than 20,000 souls. I know I'm rereading. We have Jerusalem and all the major towns in ruins. These peasants eked out a subsistence as small farmers and raisers of livestock. Some idea of their wretched lot may be gathered from the Lamentations of Jeremiah, which, though poetic, captures very realistically what life must have been like, not only for the prophet, but also for the average citizen. See also Ezekiel 33. One must not conclude, however, that there was no sense of community in Judah anymore. There surely were efforts to rebuild not only houses in town, but also the infrastructures of social life. And within the providential structures imposed upon the land by the Babylonians, there emerged some kind of local government. Wherever the cult did not disappear, although with the destruction of the temple, it must have taken a different shape from the known previously. Likely something akin to the synagogues that arose elsewhere in the latter diaspora must have come into existence in Judah to meet the needs of the people for corporate worship and study of Torah. On the whole, however, the biblical texts are nearly silent concerning the nature and activities of the non-exilic community in Babylon. Ironically, although Judah remained the geographical locus of the covenant race, Babylon became its historical, theological, and intellectual home. And this was true not only in the years of the exile, but also for the centuries to come. Indeed, in the first several centuries of the Christian era, Babylon was the center of the thriving religious community that had generated its own Jewish tradition separate from Jerusalem and Alexandria. The devout scribes and scholars created the Babylonian tablet and the Babylonian Masoretic school, produced its own families of biblical texts and manuscripts. This is not surprising for the exiles, although they must not have been numerous with the cream of the Jewish political, intellectual, and religious life. They began to live in their own ghettos. Once it was evident that they would be there for a long time, they began to settle down, purchase property, and engage in business. There is evidence that some of them attempted resistance early on, but they eventually came to see the peaceful coexistence with the only practical course. They became so comfortable with the majority did not return to Judah once the way had been cleared by the decree of Cyrus. The view of Ezekiel. The view of Ezekiel. The best insight into exilic life in Babylonia is provided by the prophet Ezekiel, who spent all of the years of public ministry there. Like Jeremiah, Ezekiel was a priest, is clear from his express testimony, Ezekiel 1:3, and his great interest in matters of the cult. His writings are particularly helpful to an investigation because they are, for the most part, in chronological order and are usually replete with chronological and historical data. The prophet begins his account by establishing the setting. He was with the exiles by the Kabar River in the 30th year. The Kabar is a Nar Kabari mentioned in Babylonian records, a canal that forms an extension of the Euphrates River. By 30th year, Ezekiel most likely is referring to his own 30th year. This was 593 BC, the 5th year of the exile Jehoiachin, as the prophet himself states. His habit of dating the events in terms of the exile Jehoiachin substantiates the point previously made that Jehoiachin, not Zedekiah, was considered the true Davidic heir. Exile was commissioned by the Lord to minister to the exile community that lived near the Kabar, particularly to those in the settlement of Tel Aviv. His message to the exile concerned the imminent destruction of Jerusalem. They undoubtedly thought that the holy city would survive, even though they had been carried away from it. They had to be made to understand, however, that Jerusalem was invincible only as long as God's people were true to him. As matters struck, they had found to remain loyal. In fact, the situation back in Jerusalem was worse than it had been before. The result would be imminent and irredeemable judgment. Through a series of graphic illustrations drawing a picture of the city under siege, shaving his hair, preparing chains of slavery, Ezekiel proclaimed the impending doom of Zion. In the 6th year, 592, Ezekiel was sitting in his house with the council of Jewish elders when the Lord suddenly took him in a vision to Jerusalem, where he witnessed a series of abominable religious perversions perpetuated by the leaders of Judah in the holy temple itself, Ezekiel 8. The result was the departure of the cherubim and the glory of the Lord from the temple and the suspension of the Mount of Olives. This signified that the annihilation of the city and the temple was a foregone conclusion. But before we saw the divine glory depart, Ezekiel heard the same promise that all of his prophetic forebears had heard. God's people might go into bitter captivity and bondage for the sin, but God will give them a new heart to love and serve him and will bring them back once again to their land. Like dry bones brought back to life, they will be rejuvenated and reunited. Israel with Judah and David himself will be king over them. Ezekiel 11:37. The view of Daniel. Daniel is the second major source of information for the life of the exiles of Babylonia prior to Cyrus' decree. Daniel lived beyond the era and also provided invaluable documentation for the Persian rule in Babylonia under Darius, Mede, and Cyrus. It's impossible here to enter the debate concerning the veracity of either Daniel or the events he describes, but his accounts have not been shown to be contrary to what is known from extra-biblical texts, and his rhetoric and language are eminently at home at the 6th century, the era in which the book purports to have been written. It is only on the most subjective and circular lines of evidence that the man and his writings have been denied historicity. According to his own account, Daniel was among the nobility taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar during his first conquest of Jerusalem, 605. Soon after, 597 is the other day. I remember that now. Soon after arriving in Babylon, Daniel, when some of the young Conrads were selected by Ashpenaz, a court official, to be trained in the arts and sciences of Babylonia. Their apparent goal was to prepare them to be members of the diplomatic corps who could someday represent Babylonia's interests, perhaps in Palestine itself. They were apt students, but they refused to violate their religious convictions in order to conform to the Babylonian custom. Nebuchadnezzar, in his second year, had a dream that greatly disturbed him. Daniel 2. Unable to recall it, he demanded of his diviners that they reveal both the dream and his meaning under penalty of death. When none could do so, Daniel offered his good offices. Informing the king that he spoke only at the emissary of the true God, Daniel revealed not only the dream, but also its interpretation. Convinced Daniel spoke truth, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the power of Yahweh, promoted Daniel and his three friends to positions excuse me, of great authority to the province of Babylon. Although neither Daniel nor his fellows can be identified in the extra biblical text, there is abundant evidence that foreigners, including Jews, rose through the ranks of Babylonian government and occasionally reached the highest echelons. Sometime later, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream where Daniel interpreted to mean the king, because of his hubris in refusing to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Most High, would be reduced to a bestial existence and for 7 years would be insane and unable to rule. Daniel 4. At the end of the 7 years, he would be restored and resume his regency. All things came to pass as the prophet predicted. And Nebuchadnezzar last acknowledged that he would be was but a pawn in the hand of the heavenly king. Skeptic scholars deny that Nebuchadnezzar ever suffered the malady described by Daniel, but their argument is extremely shaky. Although the king's insanity is yet to be corroborated by extra-biblical documentation, the Babylonian records are almost totally silent on the years when such an affliction is most likely to have happened, the last decade of his life. Efforts to salvage credibility for the story by suggesting that Daniel was referring to Nabonidus rather than Nebuchadnezzar are unsatisfying, for not only do they vitiate the reliability of Daniel's source material, but the alleged insanity of Nabonidus bears little resemblance to the state of affairs recounted in Daniel. For reasons unclear, Daniel says nothing of the period between the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and that of Belshazzar. What next, taking up his pen, he recalls a momentous night in 539 when Belshazzar, in a drunken orgy, received a word from God of heaven, and the Medes and the Persians were on their way to bring an end to the reign and seize his kingdom for themselves. Realizing perhaps the inevitability of the judgment, Belshazzar, perhaps his finest honor, honored the man who brought him to the faithful message by making him third ruler in the kingdom. This implies that Nabonidus was first, his son Belshazzar second, and Daniel third. This arrangement was no sooner made than it came to a tragic end, for Nabonidus was taken prisoner by Guburu, the Persian general. Belshazzar was slain, and Babylon became just another of the satrapies in the Persian Empire. Daniel's references to Darius the Mede in Daniel 5 and 6, Darius son of Xerxes in 9:1, appear to be his way of describing his general Guburu. It was he who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom by Cyrus. This change in rulership over Babylon only enhanced Daniel's opportunities for statesmanship, for Cyrus soon saw in him an able minister who had distinguished himself in the Babylonian public office for more than 60 years. Darius the Mede, therefore, appointed him to be one of the three supervisors over the providential system of the empire. So capable was Daniel that Darius planned to elevate him to the very top of the government. But Daniel's peers, filled with envy, concocted a scheme that obliged the king to sentence Daniel to death. Daniel was delivered, however, by the miracle caused Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, to confess the superiority of Daniel's God. It was in the first year of Darius the Mede that Daniel came to understand that the 70 years of which Jeremiah spoke of was about to expire, and that his compatriots would soon return to rebuild the temple which lay in ruins in chapter 9. The decree of Cyrus was about to be issued, and thousands of Jews will return to Jerusalem to reestablish the covenant community to sacred soil. Daniel, however, rightly saw that his exile still in force as long as the temple remained unrestored. His prayer that God should look with favor upon the desolate sanctuary and cause his holy name to dwell there once again. The answer to his prayer came to pass in a remarkable way when Haggai and Zechariah inspired the people to build the dwelling place of Yahweh once again. But there was an even greater response to Daniel's fervent prayer. Building on the idea of the 70 years of exile, Yahweh promised the end of the 77th, 70 weeks of years. He would do something far more wonderful than rebuild his temple. He would send the Anointed One, the Messianic Savior, who would die for his people, and thereby put an end to the age-long opposition to the purposes of God. 9:24-27 in Egypt. The third main center of Jewish population after the collapse of Judah was Egypt. The land of the Nile had always been a favorite place of refuge for the people of Israel. Abraham had gone there in a time of famine. Joseph and later Jacob and his family settled there, and then Jeroboam sought and found asylum. This was because of Egypt's physical proximity to Palestine, and also because of a certain sense of affinity between the two peoples. Although Egypt was a slave, the Israelites had thereafter symbolized and typified bondage, and nonetheless was viewed with special favor by the Lord. Many of the eschatological promises or blessings for Israel included special benefits for Egypt as well. Isaiah 19. It is not surprising then the Israelite and Judean refugees fled to Egypt and again in the biblical times. Almost certainly they did so at the time of the conquest of Samaria by the Syrians in 722, and Jeremiah reports he participated in the move to Egypt after Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar in Jeremiah 43. This contingent consisted of the principal military officers and members of the royal family of the Jews who had recently returned to Judah from neighboring lands after the appointment of Gedaliah as governor. This immediately destination was Tophanes, Daphna in the eastern delta, Jeremiah 43. But they eventually settled also in Migdal, Tel El Hair, in the northeast delta in the Memphis. As early as Jeremiah's time, they filtered south in Upper Egypt, either creating new settlements there or joining those already in existence, Jeremiah 44. The migration to Egypt was looked upon with disfavor by the Lord, Jeremiah 42, for it left the pitiful remnant of Judah with only a very fragile base. Besides, the Jews already in Egypt have begun to abandon Yahwistic faith and worship the gods of the adopted land. The result will be the judgment of the Lord upon Egypt at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, and with it will come the decimation of the Jewish community that had settled there. The Babylonian conquest came indeed and brought about the devastation prophesied by Jeremiah. But not all the Jews of Egypt perished, for at least one colony, that of the Elephantine in Upper Egypt, survived and in post-exilic times became the center not only of Jewish political life, but also of a cult associated with the rival temple. Even later, in the 4th century, Alexander encouraged the relocation of the thousands of Jews from Palestine to his new city of Alexandria. Within a few generations, the community became perhaps the most vibrant and creative focus of Jewish life and thought in the world. The world situation during the period of restoration. It is important now to examine the historical cultural context in which the exilic communities, particularly those of Babylonian, returned to the land of promise and undertook the restoration predicted by all the prophets. The biblical sources, particularly Ezra and Nehemiah, provided the rich running information for the period for the decrees of Cyrus, 438, to the governorship of Nehemiah, 430, but this information must be fleshed out by a careful reconstruction of contemporary Persian history. Cambyses II of Persia. In 530, Cyrus went to Jadaxerxes River area in Central Asia to put down a independent faction of the northeast border of the Madagascar. He was mortally wounded in the conflict, however, was expired within 3 days. Cambyses, his son, whom he had left in charge at home, brought his father's body back to Parasagade for a burial and then assumed the Achaemenid throne. Cambyses II, 530 to 522, had held important posts in Persian government for many years, and as early as 538 had been designated by Cyrus as the heir apparent. At the time of his accession, he was governor of the important district around Sippar, north of Babylon, and even bore the title King of Babylon, indicating clearly the prestige he enjoyed. Upon taking the throne, he sought to enhance the prestige and secure succession by marrying the sisters of slain his full brother, Baradiah, a deed he concealed from the public. The first major action of the new king was the invasion of Egypt, and only one of the four major Persian kingdoms, Media, Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, remaining to be conquered. With Phoenician and allies, he attacked Amasis II in 570, 526, and followed up with victory over Psamtik III, 526 to 525, at Pelnesium. After executing Psamtik, Cambyses marched south all the way to the Ethiopian border, annexing the Ethiopian territories lying thereby. He then organized all of Egypt into a satrapy called Modaria and Memphis as the capital. He named his kinsman Aridandes the satrap over his new jurisdiction and then headed back to Persia. Cambyses had no sooner started out than he learned that his super claiming to be Baradiah, his murdered brother, had seized power. This impostor, probably either Smerdes or Gautama, first gained the following in Babylon, and then on July 1st, 552, he was acclaimed king throughout the entire empire. When Cambyses saw that all was lost, he committed suicide. Darius Histippus of Persia. Gamata's success ironically lay in the fact that Cambyses had concealed Barada's death and so had no way now to prove it. One may assume that Barada had achieved great popularity with certain elements of resenting Cambyses' succession. Not everyone, however, was filled by Gautama, so a plot was soon underway to remove the usurper and restore legitimate government to Persia. The leadership of this coup was in the hands of Darius Histippus, who was with the six collaborators assassinated Gautama on September 29, 522, and placed himself in power. This coup was not a popular move, for Darius, though of royal blood by virtue of the descent from Ctesippus through Arimanes, was not of the immediate family of Cyrus. In order to forestall further opposition, he preferred a lengthy inscription in which he revealed in detail the murder of Bardiya by Cabesius. In fact, the Gotham was not Bardiya after all, but an impostor. All of these efforts managed to quell the uneasiness of the Persian leaders themselves. Rebellions erupted throughout the empire. Babylonia, because of its size and importance, was of particular concern to Darius. Too weak at first to bring this major satrapy under control militarily, Darius worked through diplomatic channels, and by 520 was able to reassert Persian authority in Babylon. With Babylon back in line, the rest of the rebel states soon reaffirmed their loyalty. With peace and stability once more a reality, Darius proceeded to implement far-reaching administrative reforms. Of no little importance was the continuing development of a legal system that was already becoming famous for the unalterability of the king's edicts. Both Daniel 6, Esther 1 show an awareness of the feature of the Persian jurisprudence, founded no doubt on ancient legal proceeding such as the Code of Hammurabi. Law under Darius was administered with at least a theoretical concern for justice. Another accomplishment was the introduction of a completely revised fiscal policy. Darius led the way into standardizing coinage of weights and measures, thus facilitating trade and commerce. Unfortunately, these reforms were accompanied by a drastic inflationary spiral, and in turn brought further governmental intervention and control in the private sector. This proved to be extremely unpopular throughout the empire, and before long caused severe repercussions that nearly brought Darius to ruin. A third area of intense activity was the massive building projects. By 521, Darius had removed the capital of Susa in Old Elam, 300 miles northeast of Paris-Sagade, and there erected a magnificent palace. Both Esther and Nehemiah refer to the structure as the citadel of Susa, Shushan, the palace, King James Version. Later in his reign, Darius undertook the construction of a new city called Persepolis, where he hoped to locate the capital permanently. He was able only to begin the project, so his son and successor Xerxes carried it through to completion. Susa, however, seems to have continued the real center of government, whereas Persepolis was more or less a showplace, a tourist attraction to which successive generations of Persian kings took important guests to impress them. The only significant area of the empire that remained intractable in 520 was the satrapy of Mardaria, that is, in Egypt. Darius set out for his distant land in 519, passing his caravans and armies had for millennia through Syria and Palestine. These lands of the Mediterranean littoral were the part of the Babylonian satrapy, but because of the distance for both Babylon and Susa, were less susceptible to supervision. As a result, turmoil was incessant, and only when the Persian kings intervened directly could some measure of order be established. This was the. Uh-oh. I'm frozen. Gotta get unfrozen. Alright, here we go. This was the case in 520 in Judah. The Jews had begun the reconstruction of Jerusalem, and the temple had immediately encountered opposition from both the Samaritans and the Tatani, the satrap of the province. Darius was told by the Jewish leaders that Cyrus himself had authorized the building projects. When he researched the royal archives and discovered that this indeed was true, he ordered the hostilities against the Jews to cease at once. No doubt his itinerary, though in Palestine, had somewhat to do with the alacrity with which he wishes were implemented. I don't know that word. After a punitive campaign deep into Egypt, Darius remained in Susa for the next several years, but eventually resumed his expansionism. By about 516, he had pressed east as far as India and then returned to Africa to deal with the Libyans. His northern penetrations were not so successful, however, for he met stiff resistance from the Scythians and were forced to retreat. Still unsatisfied, he set his sights on Europe. His first attempt to bring the independent Aegean states under control fell when Ionian states that were already under Persian suzerainty broke free to assist or harass kinfolk. He eventually prevailed, however, and incorporated all of Western Asia into this realm. Flushed with success, Darius made an ill-advised sweep across the Aegean Sea in the year 490 with the intent of conquering Athens and the other city-states of the Greek peninsula. The city of Eretria suffered destruction and enslavement. Aroused, the Athenians met Darius head-on. In the decisive battle of Marathon, the Persians underwent a humiliating defeat and were forced to retreat to the Asian mainland. Convinced the victory had eluded them only because of insufficient manpower, Darius resolved to return once more to Greece to finish what he had begun. A revolt in Egypt, however, preempted the action. Before Darius could resolve this new problem and resume his European operations, he died, leaving his grand design to his son Xerxes in 486 to 465. Although Darius suffered from the same character defects that afflict most powerful rulers, overweening pride, selfish ambition, and the unrealistic overestimation of their capabilities, he was relatively far-sighted, cultured, and benign. As noted, he designed and commenced the construction of the magnificent city of Persepolis, to this day regarded as one of the wonders of the ancient world. He also sponsored the digging of the canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. Of more significance than either of these, however, was the establishment of the highway network that laced his vast empire together, and a postal system that permitted rapid communication on a scale undreamed of before his time. Most important of all, he provided the secure milieu in which the uh, the newly returned and struggling Jewish community could once more seek roots into the soil of the Holy Land. Under his sovereignty, they were free from the threat of everything but petty annoyance from hostile neighbors. The first return. Cyrus is the agent of Yahweh. In the 19th century, a barrel-shaped inscription was discovered that recorded Cyrus the Great decreed the captive peoples of Babylon could return to their places of origin. The inscription was primarily a propaganda piece designed to check out more content, old stuff, new stuff. It's all good. How do I end this thing? Uh-oh. Where's the end button?